Welcome back to another APUSH history video lecture. Today we're going to be taking a look at the causes of the American Revolution. So this is really important, right? And it's something that we're pretty used to in our identity because, hey, we celebrate the 4th of July every single year, right? And we know all about why Americans rebelled. Go America! Except actually it's a little bit more complicated than you might think. A lot of our traditional sort of like mythical narratives about why we ended up with the causes of the American Revolution may not be as clear as you think. So let's walk through this and see what actually might have led up to the American Revolution. First of all, I think it's really important, and this is sort of like myth number one, right, is that Americans did not see themselves as Americans until probably about 1776. Up until that time period, Americans saw themselves as English citizens. In fact, Americans believed that they were the true British who were trying to reform the British from afar. A good example of that was the Puritans. Even in the case of the Chesapeake, where we don't have the Puritans, we still had English citizens who were very loyal to the king. These were these noble sons who came over in order to find land, who ended up settling down in the Chesapeake, and they ended up owning slaves and cultivating tobacco. In their mind, they were truly English. They were following the English king and following the Anglican Church. So why do we get a revolution? Okay, well, in order to understand this, we've got to go back about 40 or 50 years before the American Revolution and start off with a key event that really changed things around. That's the religious Great Awakening. In this Great Awakening, we had two very important preachers, George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, and they started calling up these old notions of English Puritanism. They called themselves the New Lights. And who were these New Lights? They were people who were criticizing the Old Lights, and the Old Lights were the leaders of the Anglican Church. The idea was the Anglican Church had given in too much to rationalism. And what's that? That comes from the Enlightenment. You might remember from studying last year that the Enlightenment was all about this idea that if we used our reason, we could figure out the laws of nature. And figuring out the laws of nature, we could figure out how the universe worked, and then we could control and manipulate it a bit. That stretched over into philosophy, where we had a lot of ideas about the notion that humans had rights, and these rights allowed us to then challenge our government. So that'll be important for the American Revolution. Along came George Whitefield, though, and Jonathan Edwards, and they said there's a big problem here, though. The problem is humans are relying too much on reason. In fact, in their mind, it led to what they believed was a heresy within Christianity known as deism. Deism was the idea that using our minds, we could study the universe and realize that God was sort of like the big clockmaker. He made the clock, and he stepped out of the universe, and he's off somewhere else partying. Well, we're just trying to figure out things here based on the natural laws that he created, sort of like somebody who makes a clock. Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield said, that's not right. Actually, God is very much intervening in our lives, and in fact, we are sinful people who need his grace. One of the best examples of this is Jonathan Edwards. He gave a huge sermon called In the Hands of a Angry God, in which he compared human beings to basically a spider that God just holds over the fires and is about to let down. The only thing that keeps us from doing so is repenting and God's mercy and love. So what does this guy do with the American Revolution? Well, who were the New Lights criticizing? They were criticizing the Old Lights, the Anglican leaders. Who are the Anglican leaders? They are the leaders who represent the king within the Anglican Church, the national British Church. This started to cause sort of a criticism of the king and his associates as being corrupt. Okay, so that was sort of our first big cause, but then there was a second big cause. And it had to do with a major war that took place called the French and Indian War. French and Indian War, don't get this all wrong. People tend to think it's the French versus the Indian. It's not. What ended up happening was George Washington at that time, a colonel in the British Army, was sent out to Tennessee, the territory of Tennessee. And there, at a place called Fort Necessity, he opened fire on the French. That triggered a war that eventually became a global war that lasted for 7 years out in Europe. By the end of that war, the British won, and when they did, they kicked the French out of America. And by doing that, the upside was, from here on out, the British and their British colonists felt secure and safe within the Americas. The downside was that this was one of these many mercantile wars between France and Britain that led to a massive war debt. And by the end of this, the British had to pay this off. That then led into what I'm sure all of you guys know about, which are the many taxes that were levied at that point against Americans. So why are these taxes being levied? Well, they're being levied to pay off that war debt, right? And this is where our big myth comes in. A lot of times Americans think, oh, those British, right, they were taxing us so heavily. Actually, they weren't. The British taxes on the Americans were far less than the taxes that people had to pay back in England. And they had a specific purpose. The taxes were meant to pay off the war debt. Remember, that was the war that protected Americans from the French. So what were these different taxes? The first one was an act, not a tax, called the Currency Act. And the Currency Act basically mandated that Americans had to use the British pound, not local metals, in order to do their trading. Why would the British do something like this? Well, because by using the British pound, it made sure that the British currency was being used and could be taxed in order to pay off the war debt. If Americans made up currencies, they couldn't really tax those, and then you wouldn't be able to pay off the war debt. For Americans, though, by resorting strictly to the British currency, that was a real problem, because that meant there wasn't quite as much currency that was out there. Take, for example, another act that was passed called the Navigation Act. The Navigation Act limited Americans to only trade with the British. It's going to be really important when it comes to the trade of rum and sugar in the West Indies. Why does that matter? Because the British feared that if Americans were trading with other countries, they were in essence giving their wealth to those other countries. If we traded with the French in the West Indies, that means the French got that wealth, and what would they do with it? They'd invest in an army, and the fear was they would come back one day to take back the lands that they had lost. The biggest one, though, was the Stamp Act of 1763. In 1763, the British levied a tax basically on all forms of paper goods here in the Americas, and that really ended up causing major riots, especially within the area of Boston. And this tends to be the big symbol people remember from the American Revolution. Okay, a little bit of a problem there. While it was true that they taxed paper goods, the paper goods tended to be things like wills and testaments. Who are the primary people being affected by that? Well, the wealthy colonists, right? They're the ones who most often interact with that. This was not as widespread a tax as people tend to think it was. But symbolically, because it was on paper goods, it led into a huge protest, and eventually the British got rid of the tax, although they passed an act called the Declaratory Act, in which they said we, the British Parliament, were the ones who get to determine that that act is abolished, not the Americans who are doing the revolution. Then came the biggest sticking point, and that was the Proclamation of 1763. Proclamation of 1763 said that Americans could not move into the Ohio River Valley. This really angered Americans. Felt like, we just fought a war with you, and you're not letting us move into this land, and we know why. There are natives out in that land, and somehow, for some reason, you are protecting them. Why were the English doing this? Well, because the English needed those allies. Those were the allies that helped them to kick the French out, and they were worried that by Americans encroaching into that land, that would cause a new war that they would then have to go and protect the Americans from. Now, we go even further, right, and we have something called the Quartering Act, in which Americans were forced to pay, and there were two of these. The first Quartering Act, the Americans had to pay for food, and they also had to pay for a place to keep British soldiers who were here in the Americas. Again, horrible stuff, right? Except, why were they doing this? Well, because remember, we had those protests and riots in 1763. They had brought in this army in order to create security. It's sort of like when we have had riots here in Los Angeles, like back in 1991. What did we do? We brought in the National Guard. And while it's true that we don't, house them somewhere, we do pay taxes for the National Guard, right? So we kind of do the same thing that the British were doing. Okay, the politics led into a series of major prime ministers who tried to resolve this problem with the colonies. The first was a man named Prime Minister Grenville. He's the guy who established the Stamp Act in the hope to pay off the debt. When that didn't work, a new prime minister was put into power, and his name was Townsend. Townsend hated the colonists, but he decided to compromise with them. Compromise was this. The colonists claimed, the real reason we have problems with taxes is internal versus external taxes. What the heck does that mean? So here's the idea. Typically, Americans had been taxed in mercantilism on tariffs. Okay, meaning goods that are traded back and forth, they were taxed on. That's an external tax, meaning as trade comes in, that gets taxed. As trade goes out, that gets taxed. The Stamp Act was an internal tax. Activities that went on within the colonies were being taxed, right? So Townsend said, fine, you guys are annoying, but I'll give it to you. Whatever. You guys will just be taxed on tariffs, which at first worked. Except the Americans eventually got upset with that and started protesting against that. In fact, at one point they got so upset that they attacked a British ship called the Gaspee and destroyed the property on the Gaspee. Then on top of that, the British established an act called the Tea Act. This particular Tea Act gave the British East India Tea Company a monopoly over tea trade throughout the British Empire. This was actually a standard practice that states would do, governments would do during mercantilism at this time. Now I know you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, a monopoly, right? Prices skyrocketed, horrible things, Actually, quite the opposite. In order to get this monopoly, the British East India Tea Company had to lower their prices on tea for the Americans. So why were the Americans so upset? They claimed that this was a demonstration of a restriction on their trade. So how did they respond? They did the Boston Tea Party. Dressing up as Native Americans, they went on the ships and destroyed tons of property on these British ships. That then brought up the last of the prime ministers, a man named Prime Minister North. Prime Minister North, who came into power, punished the colonies by establishing what are called the Coercive Acts, or known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. He shut down Massachusetts, he shut down Boston Port and said, you will pay for this, otherwise we're not opening up your trade again. At that point, Americans are going to come together and they're going to start to say, we need to rebel against this system. Now, let's keep in mind a few things, though, about that. Americans as a whole were not saying that. It was primarily within Massachusetts and Boston, in which we got a patriot group that said the British have gone too far. 2/3 of the colonists, though, either said, we're going to remain loyal to the kingdom. We're kind of in the middle on this issue. So what are our takeaways on this? A lot of stuff to talk about here. Number one, Americans thought of themselves as British. In fact, more than British. Up until the beginning of the American Revolution. That's going to be a problem for the revolutionaries when they get going. Number two, the French and Indian War really changed things around. Why did it change things around? Because once that was done, the British colonists felt safe and comfortable, and now they turned their anger towards Britain, and their anger came about because Britain was trying to pay off their war debt. And number three, the real issue here is not taxes. Taxes were actually not that high on Americans. The real issue is politics and political representation. At the time, Britain would represent the Americans through something called virtual representation. That meant that people with land back in England represented the entire empire in Parliament. What Americans wanted was direct representation. They wanted to make sure that every single colonist with land, also who was white and a male, would be able to vote and be able to have an impact within the British system. That fight over politics, that fight over representation, was going to change the way things were done in the Americas, and especially would be important for getting rid of the old system of social inequalities and social deference. Okay, see you in class.